Hey there. So I know this is a little bit of a different style of video from what I would normally do on this channel, but for one, it might be for an assignment for a class, and for two, I actually think this will be a good resource for the public to use, as when you go to look for writing and just general literacy advice for high level, like high school and college level writing, and even a little bit above college level for people looking for their doctorate or just a higher level education in general. It's very lacking, and you see a lot of videos, but they're typically geared towards a very young audience, and therefore has little to no practical application in such an academic setting. So this is for if you're in your first, maybe second college level English class, and you're looking to strengthen your informative writing. And I got you. I'm going to try and make this simple. I'm going to try to provide information for people who feel very lost, but also provide tips for people who are already very experienced and who are looking to actually strengthen their writing further. So, first things first, let's talk about what informative writing is and maybe some different types of topics and how that will change your structure a little bit. So, I think one of the biggest misconceptions that I see among especially new kind of fledgling writers is they want to restate and emphasize the points made in other sources that they went to research, and they know what they're talking about, but they don't form a unique thought on the subject. And it doesn't always have to be unique per se, but you do have to have a thesis that is clear, concise, and maybe gleans multiple ideas from different sources. So basically just taking those and putting them into a strong thesis that is hopefully unique to your paper. So it's conveying an idea, and the other, I would say, untold goal of high-level writing, especially in an informative sense, is to inform, but also to provoke questions and critical thought. You want to pose questions and provide the reader with knowledge to actually answer those questions themselves. This is essentially so that way readers still are informed, but it's a really good way to keep them engaged and entertained. If you are reading an informative writing piece and it just gives you ideas and you have to take those ideas individually rather than have questions to consider while you're digesting everything, it's going to make it not only boring, but actually less informative than it would have been had there been some unknowns that were posed throughout the essay. And this, furthermore, to a greater extent with subjects like psychology and quantum mechanics and other very scientific and scientific subject geared papers, if you pose questions throughout, it actually allows for the reader to potentially provide unique information. This is how ideas are shared in spaces like that. So it's a pretty important tool of writing in any setting, but especially in those, you might want to have some key questions that you pose in the beginning. This isn't required. It's not a way that you have to do your hook, but it certainly helps to make your paper more engaging. And then it falls upon the author to answer the questions that the reader might have that have already been determined through other sources. So this is not to say that you should pose everything as a question. The things that are already determined and set by other sources, and the ideas that are very clear and would simply be redundant to voice in a question, absolutely say that as a statement. But also don't say everything as a statement, is essentially what I'm getting at. So I'm going to break down structure very simply, and then we're going to talk about how you can actually stray away from the basic structure of an informative paper if you are a strong enough writer. I do not recommend this for everyone, and I want to make that super clear. So when I do eventually get to breaking away from the regular structure of a informative research type essay, please feel free to skip past that part of the video if you know that you are not at the level where you should be straying away from basic structure. So I'm going to sequentially talk about the steps for writing, but also insert the structure in here, as I feel like this flows best and it'll be the most cohesive way to explain each step as we go. So starting with the first step, you're going to want to select a topic. There's really no way for this not to be your first step. It's pretty clear. So find something that's interesting to you. Sometimes you'll be given a prompt, which can suck, I know, but try to find something that is interesting to you if the prompt is up to you, or if it's a more open prompt, try really hard to find something that does interest you, because there's no way around it. It's going to suck if you don't like what you're writing about. What I've done in the past for even just regular research projects and not even essays, or if I have to make a slideshow, or just in general, if I have to pick a broad topic that I'm not a fan of, what I try to do is I try to find a topic that I like within the broader topic. For example, and this is something that's really wide and not all your prompts will be this broad, but for a history class, I had to make a project basically depicting an aspect of, I believe it was World War I, maybe, and I'm not a fan of history. I'm really not a huge history buff, so I was naturally pretty annoyed. But what I was able to do was make an essay that involved the chemical warfare weapons, which I am interested in chemistry, and I was able to break it down from that lens in a way that was unique and still informative. So I highly encourage you to apply that principle of trying to take a topic that you don't like and find a subject matter that you like within it, because it will help you an enormous amount whenever you actually have to get to writing the essay. This brings me to the next step, which is research. Go research your topic. It's pretty simple. The only, caveat is if you do have a research database, you have to be careful. If you don't have a research database, you should make sure that there's not any blacklisted websites that your professor or teacher does not want you to use, because that can become a problem. Most of the time you'll have a database, especially at college level, but if you don't, just make sure you're wary of what sources you're using and making sure they're reliable and allowed by the professor. This step, I would say, is optional for more experienced writers, but if you are not an experienced writer and if you find this as a helpful tool to you, then please go ahead. There's a lot of things in literacy in general that apply this way, where if you're more experienced, you can generally just have a intuitive feel for it, but if you can't do that, then please, please, please use this as a tool. This is creating an outline. So you've conducted your research, you've found good sources. What I like to do when I find good sources is go ahead and make my citations, so I might reference my citations, go back to them, take one last glance over the research, and now you're going to come up with a solid idea for your essay. This doesn't have to be your thesis, but it can absolutely be your thesis. And off of this idea, you want to decide how you want to outline your essay, because if you pick specific ideas, then the order is going to matter. For example, if you're doing a historical essay on history, depending on the way you want to inform people about history, you are going to want the paragraphs to be outlined in a certain way, in a certain sequential order. So if none of those apply to you and you just want to do a normal outline, generally this is the order in which it will go. I'll put an example on screen as well of one that I just drafted up. I don't normally write outlines because I generally know what order I want my ideas to be in, because that's really all this is deciding what order you want your ideas in and the best way that they will support your introduction and conclusion. It's also a way to kind of see everything and see the skeleton or the base infrastructure of your writing before you actually begin adding, the meat of the writing to it. The next step, and the step that people dread the most, is to actually write the essay. So you're going to have to follow the structure of your outline, which should have had each part of the essay in it, and at this point, you have to actually write it up. So let's actually take a second here to talk about the different parts of your essay and how they should be written. And here's where we're going to talk about structure a little more. So the most basic and common structure you'll see for an informative essay is an intro, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. And it's simple. It is basic, but it gets the job done, and it can make for a strong essay that still has a lot of character and definitely will get you that 100% that you're looking for. So, starting with the intro, I want to talk about a thesis and topic sentences, because unfortunately I see that this is lacking in a surprising amount of papers at this level, and I think it's simply from a lack of attention from teachers, throughout middle school, who focus on more things like vocabulary and maybe even studying like classical works, which is great in its own place, but I don't think there's enough focus on some of the literary structure that we're going to talk about here. So let's talk about theses. So your thesis is going to be 90% of the time an informative essay, literally just talking about what you researched. I would pick 3 key points, and the most interesting points and the most summative points that accurately describe what you researched, and then I would restate them in the thesis. So, for example, if you researched about planes, I'm not a big plane guy, so I'm going to pick like the most basic key facts. Yours would be more interesting, but the thesis might look like planes were invented in 1979. They were a key part in future wars. They were super helpful in the infrastructure of modern society and also fast travel between civilizations. That is a very general and potentially inaccurate thesis, but that would be a somewhat strong one to come up with off the bat. It states your 3 main points, and if those are listed as your topic sentences as well, and you have your paragraphs supporting that really well and connecting the evidence well, then that would be a good example. So that was just a quick example off the top of my head. I might put another one on the screen that kind of highlights the different parts and breaks it down a little bit better. But that's generally what your thesis should look like. And as far as the rest of the intro, the part that a lot of people I see talk about, especially at this level, people get excited about writing a hook. A hook is a hook. It's fine. I've personally never found a lot of excitement for it, but you do want to grab your reader's attention. And it's here that I actually want to talk about something really interesting that I found when I was researching, like what makes a good introduction. So I looked at some of my more complex papers, and I saw that in all of my papers and in a lot of other strong research papers, because obviously I'm not just going to use my own, it's a bit biased, I saw that if you present a specific observation, and it doesn't even have to be an anecdote, but just a very specific observation, which can be an interesting fact, whatever, and then open up to your broader premise, it creates for a really strong introductory structure that is also super engaging, because it makes the reader want to find out why that specific observation applies. So it's a way to make a hook that is subtle, interesting, and not a question, which I see way too much, and it definitely doesn't make your paper stand out when you start with a question. This kind of psychological trick, or not even just the trick, but the way of starting from a specific idea and making way to a broader premise, is called inductive reasoning. And it's just that. It's just a fancy word to say you start with your specific claim and then you allude to a broader premise or theory. It works really well. Here's an example from my essay on Everywhere at the End of Time. My thesis states, Everywhere at the End of Time is a composition produced and composed by prolific ambient musician James Kirby, better known as The Caretaker. The composition is an honest and unsettling homage to the effects of dementia on a patient. So here I talk about couple of specific details, and then I pose a broader question. And I like to pose my questions, if I do, at the end of my introductory paragraphs, but you don't have to do that. And here I ask, thus begs the question, what commentary may lie between the ledger lines of this ambient classic? This is when I present the question. This gives the reader something to think about as they read through my essay. So the next couple steps for actually completing the essay I feel like are pretty self-explanatory, but I am going to say them just in case. You're going to want to edit your essay after you write it. You might make details in structure. This is where you'll be making a lot of fairly big changes, at least for me. I like to do it as I go, so I try to like make sure my base is strong, but some people like to view writing a little more like pottery, where you just keep playing around with it. It might crumble a couple times. I personally don't like to do that, but it's whatever works for you. So you'll make a lot of big changes, and then you'll do a final proofread. You can have this through peer review as well, which can be super helpful. So definitely don't hesitate to look to your professor or teacher and see if they would be willing to look over your paper. Definitely not every professor is willing to do this, but if you can get this as a resource, it will help you a lot. And then last step is to obviously document your citations if you haven't done that already. So those are the steps. And here is where I want to talk about the advanced writing mechanics for people who really want to bring their informative essay to the next level. So, as I already covered, the standard structure for an informative essay is one introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and then a conclusion that restates the introduction. However, with this structure in mind, various types of informative essays necessitate different approaches to the structure. So, for example, if you are doing a compare and contrast style of essay about 2 very similar plants that are edible, just think of a random example here, you would want to compare and contrast the plants, talk about how they're different, and talk about what settings you would find them in, what makes them edible, whatever. So that's a very basic example, but there's so many different types of informative essays, and therefore I encourage you, if you are a stronger writer, to look at other people's work on a similar topic and decide what kind of informative essay would suit you best. So there are other examples of this with like sequential informative essays, where you might have smaller paragraphs because you're restating specific events. For example, if you had a timeline of like, I don't know, North America, like 1800 up to modern day, there would obviously be a lot of key events, and therefore you wouldn't want to stack that all in one big paragraph where the information gets lost, especially if you want to emphasize that to the reader. Rather, you would have smaller tidbits of information. And I want to reemphasize this not only just for strong writers, but also for everyone. Make sure when you are giving supporting details in your essay, you're actually connecting the evidence to your main points. And what I mean is, if you cite a source, don't tell me what the source just told me. Tell me why what the source just told me supports your thesis and why that makes sense. Because if you're not doing that, you're having very weak writing, because all you're doing is restating what I can already clearly read on my own. Now, this video is already pretty long, but I do think I covered everything as cohesively and concisely as I could have, because at this level you do need a certain level of explaining to write very effectively. So I just want to end by kind of giving a call to action for everyone watching. You know, whether you're a low-level writer, whether you're a high-level writer, if you have not found a writer's voice yet, try to find one. Try and find a way of speaking and a way of connecting your sentences that feels not only academic, but also somewhat reminiscent of how you would explain this to someone. And obviously, you know, if you're someone who talks very casually, I don't literally mean you to your friend, but if you were to explain this in a professional setting, I want you to think about that, and I want you to try to be able to hear yourself in the writing, because that makes for writing that is about a million times more interesting, and definitely makes you a little more proud of it because it has your own character within it. So this doesn't mean that you need to present your own personal opinions or facts, but there's no problem with conveying ideas or pushing ideas in an informative essay that align with your own, and saying them, or saying is a poor word, but expressing them convincingly. So that's what I recommend. If you guys have any questions in the comments, please let me know. Feel free to subscribe, drop a like if you enjoyed the video. I really appreciate it. This was really enjoyable for me to make, because I hope this genuinely becomes a resource for other writers at this level. And yeah, I appreciate all you guys, and I'll see you in the next one.